አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምቢኝ ብሎ የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና እውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎ ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን አደባባይ ኢንፎ ሚዲያ @gmail.com፣ በዌብሳይታችን www.adebabai.com። ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ።
Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us from around the world today. This is Adebabay Media's Viewer Digest program, and my name is Hiwet, and I'll be your host for the day. Today we're going to be talking about the turmoil that is currently going on in the northern part of Ethiopia with our guest Brownan Bruton from the Atlantic Center of Atlantic Center Councils for African Center. We invite you to like, share, and stay with us.
Adebabay Media yene ነው. Adebabay Media yene ነው.
Adebabay Media yene ነው.
Adebabay Media የሁላችንም ነው.
የኛ ቤተሰብ አደባባይ ሚዲያን ይመለከታል። የእናንተስ?
Do your parents watch Adebabay Media?
Watch, follow, subscribe and help አደባባይ። አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ
ሳምራዊት አይዲ ጨክነለይ ምሕረት ግበረለይ ከካመለሰለይ አቤት ኪዳነ ምህረት በዓልቲ ጉልባብ በዓልቲ ኸለት ጥበብ አለኪ ምሕረት አቤት ክንብላ ስለ ጭኑቓት ስለ መንእሰይ ስለ غሩራት ስለ ስዱዳት ስለ ህፃናት አቤት ምንት ሰላም ምንት ምሕረት ቅዱስ መሰረት ናይ ተንቀዳሞት ኳሕኳሕቲ ማዕፆ ታቦት ዘናዴታትና ዞም ፅዋዓትና ዞም ኣቦታትና መንእሰያትና ጥዑማት ዝና መዘና ማርያም ኣደ ትሕትና አቤት መዓለብ ደዋይ መዓለብ በዋይ ጥዑማት ደሃይ ኪዳናይ ምድሪ ኪዳናይ ሰማይ ጥዑም ዝናኽን ሰጊሩ ቐላይ አቤት ስለ ጭኑቓት ስለ غሩራት ስለ ግፉዓት ስለ መንእሰይ ስለ ስዱዳት ስለ ውፁዓት አቤት ንበላ ስማናላ ገብርኤል መልአክ ብሰበሰረ ተቕዱ
Welcome back, everyone. And we were just watching a prayer by our mothers from the northern part of Ethiopia for the turmoil that's going on right now. So we just wanted to share that with you guys. And thank you again for being with us. And I would like to remind everyone to share, this conversation with us today. Today we have invited Brownan Bruton. She is a director of programs and studies of the Atlantic Council's African Center. She is a democracy and governance specialist, especially with extensive experience in Africa. So thank you so much for being here, Brunson.
Thanks so much for having me, Hiwet. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. We're here to have a conversation about what's going on in Ethiopia right now, especially in the northern part, of course. And I'd like to start this conversation with a question for you. So who is TPLF? As we have been talking about it a lot in the last few months and maybe in the last 30 years as well. So who are they?
I would expect, honestly, that your listeners probably know the answer to that question better than I do. But obviously, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front was the leading member of the EPRDF coalition. It was a liberation party that helped to free Ethiopia from the Derg in partnership with the EPLF, the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, long ago, back in 1991. Longer than probably many of your viewers are even alive, I'm guessing. But the TPLF, has, as everyone knows, had been in charge in Ethiopia effectively for almost 30 years and had presided over a long period of economic growth, but also a period of political repression that came to an end in February of 2018, followed by Prime Minister Abiy's ascension to the head of government.
Yeah. So what was their political and social philosophy as they were leading Ethiopia for 30 years, like you mentioned, about 3 decades really, and even before then, right, as they were fighting for freedom from the Derg?
Yes, I mean, as you can imagine, obviously that ideology has evolved over the years. But the TPLF throughout its history has had a fairly Marxist orientation. From the time when it was a kind of an ethno-nationalist insurgent movement against the Derg, all the way through the period that it was calling a revolutionary democracy, and now in its, if I recall correctly, democratic developmental state ideology phase, which many commentators have likened to the model that's used in China. It's effectively, a system that many countries throughout the world are using, but effectively it means that the political party in power, in this case the TPLF, has a very strong hand on the economy, and that it believes in trade-offs between economic advancement and political freedoms. And I think that's generally what people mean when they're referring to China.
So I think there are some things that we know about TPLF, a lot more things that we know about TPLF, and some we may not know. But there's always this sense of really conflict in trying to understand who TPLF is amongst Ethiopians, as well as Western media and Western political entities, right? So where do you think this conflict of understanding the idea or the identity of TPLF comes from?
I think it's hard for me to necessarily understand what TPLF is trying to be. And to be fair, I think I would say the same thing about the Republican Party here in the United States. There's what's espoused on paper and then what happens in practice. And again, like the Republican Party, the TPLF has been around for so many years that I think older members of the TPLF and younger ones probably have a different idea rightly about what the party should be trying to accomplish. The TPLF was involved in creating Ethiopia's constitution, which I think most people consider a fairly magnificent democratic document. And yet the TPLF over the years has been involved in, allegedly, in the rigging of elections and in a number of fairly serious human rights abuses, including the imprisonment of political opponents, the outlawing of civil society, and a number of things that we would generally not consider to be democratic. I think in the West, policymakers have had a hard time differentiating between what the TPLF says it's doing on paper and presents itself as doing and what the TPLF is actually doing. And part of that, I think, is lack of information. But I think part of it is also due to the TPLF's very important role in the what we used to call the war on terrorism in the United States. The fact that Ethiopia is considered to be such a valuable partner in places like Somalia in particular, but also that it plays such an important role in the Horn of Africa as a stabilizing influence. And so American policymakers in particular, but not alone, I mean, I think British, French, Norwegian, European, in general, policymakers have been very hesitant to criticize the TPLF historically because of that role that it played. So as usual, there's a tension between the democratic principles of the United States and our counterterrorism objectives.
Absolutely. I actually never heard the idea that you just mentioned, the older leadership of TPLF and the younger. What is the difference between the two? If you can elaborate on that a bit.
Sure. Well, to be honest, I don't know that there is a difference, but I think there's often a generational divide between young Africans and older ones. And I think that it's one of the things that Prime Minister Abiy is hoping for as he enters into this military confrontation in the north, that many of the younger Tigrayans are actually eager for a generational change, because the older members of the TPLF have been in power for so long, that I think one might hope or assume that there is some appetite for change on the part of the younger generation of Tigrayans. And again, I don't know that for sure, but I would say if that's not the case, then the TPLF is the only political party in the world that isn't experiencing that.
Okay, so it's more of an understanding of that happens everywhere. So chances are it's happening in Ethiopia and the TPLF structure as well.
I would be surprised. Yeah. I mean, obviously, Debretsion has not been in charge of the TPLF for this entire time. Meles Zenawi was the founder of the party and the leader for many, many years. But the same group of people has largely been in control. And I think that when you don't have changes in leadership, and I could say that, the younger members of the Democratic Party here in the U.S. are eager for Nancy Pelosi to move on, for example.
Yes, please.
As much as we love Nancy Pelosi, some of us are just saying it's time. So I would guess that that's probably the case in the TPLF too. Although, because elections in Tigray have not presumably been free and fair due to the 98.2% of the vote that they won last time around, it's hard to know for sure.
Absolutely. So I guess when we're talking about TPLF a lot, especially now with what the media is feeding, also what our friends are saying, right? People that we live with are saying, is there a difference between TPLF and the Tigrayan people, or are they synonymous in your view?
Yeah, I mean, again, I wish I had polling up from the north. But I think one of the real problems with TPLF, and particularly when we talk about the extent to which they represent the people of Tigray, is the fact that there hasn't been a free flow of information from the north. And all of the communications have been tightly controlled by this top echelon of the TPLF. And so it's one of the things that makes me most nervous, and I think makes a lot of commentators in the West nervous, is that we don't know what the reception of the Ethiopian army will be in the north. We don't know the extent to which the TPLF continues to be regarded as representing the aspirations of the Tigrayan people. And so in my view, it's an open question. As I said, I would really assume that opinion is not monolithic. It rarely is. Yeah. But I don't have evidence to back that up, unfortunately.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that makes it really hard to convince Ethiopians, right? Trying to see the party separate from the people, so we don't attach the crimes of the party to the people as well, which becomes really dangerous, because that's when we're going to get into ethnic issues that we currently are facing all over Ethiopia. But specifically speaking to TPLF, for me at least, I do my best to separate the two, because like you said, one party cannot speak for everyone, and the Tigrayan people, speaking people, are a large group of people with many different issues and opinions that they hold for themselves. So it makes it tricky, like you said, to separate the two without actual polling, actually interviewing people and seeing what they stand on. But I think for me, my comfort, I prefer to think that those two are separated. But yeah.
I agree with you, and I would also point out that it's important to remember that there is. I have observed a certain amount of anger in parts of Ethiopia over the perception that the TPLF leadership benefited disproportionately from economic and political power, but it's certainly not the case that the average Tigrayan has done so, because Tigray is less developed than most parts of Ethiopia, and certainly much less so than the South. And that's important to bear in mind, that they have not been the recipients of TPLF rule in many respects.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this also goes to the control of information that you mentioned earlier, because I find that it's difficult for people to believe that people in Tigray are still living in poverty, like extreme poverty, and they haven't seen reaped the benefits of TPLF being in power for so long as their representative. And being able to see that, really, I think we would benefit as a nation to really absorb that and say, poverty is just as bad there, so they are not the beneficials of all these crimes that we talk about, especially when we talk about TPLF. But so then now when we're talking about, you know, who they are and where they are right now, how we've gotten where we have gotten, do you believe that they've lost their political legitimacy as far as being able to come back as the central power as they have been in the last 3 decades, or has that really expired in your view?
You know, I really don't know the answer to that question. You know, I think at this moment the TPLF is politically very isolated, and I don't see any evidence anywhere in the country that people are looking forward to a return to TPLF rule. That I think is unquestionable. Whether the TPLF itself as a brand or as a party or as an idea can continue to act as a legitimate player inside Ethiopia, I don't know. You know, I think it's going to be a real challenge for Prime Minister Abiy as he, in the aftermath of the military action, you know, how he deals with the TPLF will be very important. I imagine that a lot of people who do not support in any way the actions of the TPLF leadership might nevertheless feel a strong emotional connection, a sense of identification with the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, because they have been a source of Tigrayan pride for so long. And I think that trying to eliminate the TPLF may actually alienate people in the north in a way that isn't necessary. And so I would quite honestly hope that the TPLF can be regenerated again, you know, with a new generation of leaders. That would personally, you know, I think that would be a less difficult pathway if it were possible. Mm-hmm. But I also think that what the TPLF has done, particularly in attacking the National Army base, may be a stain that's difficult to erase.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit, and then we'll come back to talking about what the goal of this war is. So when we are talking about how this war broke out, I think there seems to be different opinions as to what started it and how it went about. And I think there's a general consensus, at least from the information that I've been able to get, is that the army base was attacked that was stationed in Tigray. Did you find any other information, or is that something that is the consensus are coming to?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is an absolute consensus that the TPLF did attack the Northern Command. And I think where there is confusion or debate, if it's fair to call it that, on the Western side, is that I think people had observed prior to that the crossing of what I think everybody agrees is certainly a red line. You know, attacking a national army is a red line in any country in the world. But that prior to that, there was a lot of mutual escalation on both sides, they would say. You know, there was a sense that the TPLF was very unhappy, obviously, about having lost power in 2018. And they had objected to some of the decisions that Prime Minister Abiy had made, in particular, removing members of the TPLF from positions of authority, trying to rebalance some of the distribution of power between the nations. And I think that there is some confusion on the Washington side in particular about how, not confusion about whether the TPLF crossed the red line, but what led up to it, and if there were ways that the government or the TPLF could have de-escalated before we came to that point.
Absolutely. I think for me, what I have a hard time understanding is that Prime Minister Abiy did not come out of a vacuum, right? He came out of TPLF. He was a member of that party, and whatever political gains or losses that they have incurred because of him, it confuses me because they're the same party as far as I'm concerned. It comes from the same place. So by the end of the day, we're just still talking about not the betterment of people. Maybe we're talking about who's going to be in charge and who's going to be able to have the power that they need to do whatever they want with absolute power, right? It's not. So that's why I have a hard time seeing what the difference is between TPLF maybe and the Prime Minister Abiy's government. Do you see any difference with that, or is it just semantics, you think?
Well, I mean, I think there are a number of things that we can unpack there. You know, one of them is that I think that the Prime Minister is trying very hard to differentiate himself from the TPLF. And for example, he is trying to move towards a post-ethnic politics in Ethiopia, kind of pan-Ethiopianism that is very different from the ideology that is espoused, and both the ideology and the practice, we should say, that's espoused by the TPLF. You know, there are concerns about some non-democratic actions that have been taken by Prime Minister Abiy. You know, in particular, the closing of the press, the media space, the imprisonment of political opponents, the regular shut-off of the internet and communication networks, and all of these things definitely hark back to TPLF, to the period when the TPLF was in charge. At the same time, I think there's also, particularly in the Western media, a very unhelpful tendency to see this as a contest between the TPLF and Abiy, when in reality, as you say, I mean, they have a long history of working together in concert. And we need to recognize that Abiy, as you very rightly pointed out, was brought to power by a popular revolution. That he came to his job with a very strong mandate to perform the kind of rebalancing that we were talking about. You know, he couldn't do his job as prime minister and leave 95% of the officer posts in the national army occupied by Tigrayans. You know, that's not what the Ethiopian public brought him into power to do. And so his hands are tied in that respect. And likewise, you know, when the TPLF attacked the National Army base, the Northern Command, I don't think Prime Minister Abiy had very much of a choice about responding to that forcefully. I think he would have been removed from office if he had decided to just sort of let that go. And so I think this is clearly not a personal issue. This is one party who wants to have power and another party that doesn't want to surrender the power that it had. And so this is just a contest of wills that I tend to think is not resolvable, potentially through dialogue. And I feel that way in particular because neither of the sides have expressed any willingness to talk. But I don't think that comes down to personality. I think it comes down to you know, a situation that was created by the revolution itself.
The goal for the TPLF, and what would be a win, you think? Because I feel like if the chances of going back to the central government and being in charge is very limited, I think we could both agree. Maybe not like we can't say zero chances, but chances are very, very limited. So what is the end goal? What is a win for them as far as the fight that's going on right now?
Yeah, you know, I can't answer that question, to be honest with you. I feel very, I feel that the TPLF's position is very poor strategically. That the reality is that they are boxed in a corner of northern Ethiopia where they are surrounded by groups that are not particularly sympathetic to them, whether that's, you know, the Sudanese who've closed their borders or the Eritreans who have a long-running dispute with the TPLF or the Amhara. There's just not a lot of space for the TPLF to prosecute a successful war from that location. Yeah. And so I don't know what their end game would be. I could speculate, but it wouldn't. You know, my own view is that, yeah, I mean they're boxed into a corner, and I don't really see how they can come out of this in a stronger position than they were when they went in. That to me is just a reality.
Yeah, it's really difficult, like you said, to look around and say what could possibly be gained from this situation, except, maybe flexing and seeing who has more power, and maybe they could force Abiy into a discussion, possibly. But I'm not, I'm on the same page on that. It's just confusing to me when you look around and see, okay, you're surrounded by people that are not crazy about you. What do you do? I don't know. I think that's something that we're going to have to see in the next 6 months to 1 year, maybe. But so what is the end goal for the government? Because I feel like if Abiy is forced, Prime Minister Abiy is forced to come to a table and have a conversation, it might be, giving impunity to the TPLF, right? Anybody could do that. And who's to say, like you said in your writings, a few years from now, they might not be able to accumulate forces again and go to war to see whenever they'll be able to win, right? If that's the case. So where is this going to end for the government? What's the best outcome for the government that we could hope for?
Yeah, I mean, I think also that at least in the West, I think the government's position is also not very well understood, frankly. I think the government's calculation going into this is that it had exercised patience for a long time in regards to the TPLF, despite a very long series of provocations by TPLF leadership. And I think that the government, too, has leveled a large number of accusations against the TPLF involving the fomenting of ethnic-based violence across the country and assassination attempts. And that, although a lot of those allegations have not been proved, I think the government's case is that effectively it cannot afford to continue to allow the TPLF to continue the behaviors that brought us to this pass. That, even before the TPLF had attacked the National Army base, that they had been involved in a number of destabilizing activities, which were undermining the government's efforts to put Ethiopia on a new path to peace and prosperity and a post-EPRDF order. So for the government, I think what's most important, frankly, is disarming the TPLF and reducing its capability. There's a concern about insurgency in the north, but I think more than anything else, they're concerned about what the TPLF had been doing in the southern parts of the country and in other areas of Ethiopia. So I personally feel that the government's interests are actually, they're not looking up into Tigray so much as they are looking at Addis, looking at the Oromo region and saying, what is the TPLF has they been doing there? Then how can we stop that going forward? Personally, if the TPLF were willing to come to the table and negotiate truly, I think that the government should have its eyes wholly on the well-being of the civilians up in the north. And it would be far from the first time in the history of the world that that criminals had been granted impunity in the service of peace and law and order. And I would be the last person to criticize the government for coming to a decision like that. I think it should stay on the table. That having been said, though, I don't see willingness on the part of the TPLF to enter into those negotiations either. So it's not that the government is refusing to negotiate, but that both sides are not ready to do that, which is unfortunate. But my guess is that if the government could persuade the TPLF to disarm, they might be quite happy to give an exit strategy to some of the TPLF leaders.
So when we're if there's no end to this, as far as like a clear winner coming out of this, because it was war, there's no clear winner, especially when you're fighting with your brothers and sisters. Mm-hmm. But I feel like Prime Minister Abiy might be in a bind as well, because if he actually comes to have a conversation with the TPLF, who's to say that he's not going to lose some of his political power in Ethiopia, because now he's bringing back the people that have been kicked out essentially by an uprising, like you mentioned. But then to the same degree, though, there's that sense of who do we kill, right? When we're talking about going to war with TPLF, yes, we might be killing some of the soldiers of TPLF, and as Prime Minister Abiy had said, they're going to be as careful as possible as far as casualties, civilian casualties. But that's difficult to say so because there's so many people that are currently living in those areas. We see them leaving the country as well, and we don't know how many people have died so far because there's no information coming in and out, at least enough information coming in and out. So this is essentially a war being fought in the blind, right? We don't know much about it. So what is the responsibility of the TPLF maybe on one end to say, you know what, okay, maybe we had lost this war, let's leave the country, maybe not, you know, surrender, but leave the country and maybe strategize from abroad and see if we can win some kind of ground that way in a just as of goodwill of saving their own people, because I feel like they brought the war to Tigray, right? They brought the war to the poverty-ridden people of Tigray for no reason, right? They have the people that live in Tigray have no power to gain from this. They have nothing that they're going to gain except casualties, right? And for a party that says they care about the Tigrayan people, would that not be a strategy to take as well? And should we not be demanding for that to happen as opposed to what I've seen mostly asking Abiy to come to the table or asking Abiy to withdraw his military power?
Yeah, I mean, I personally think that it's very important for Western leaders to acknowledge that the TPLF has crossed a red line, and that Abiy is well within his rights to say what the United States says, which is that we don't negotiate with terrorists. You know, and I really hate to use the word terrorist to describe the TPLF because I think the phrase is overused. But in this case, the TPLF has taken up arms against the state.
Yeah.
And when groups take up arms against the state, they foreclose a number of possibilities. And sometimes peaceful dialogue is one of them. You know, I think that if the TPLF leaders were to say publicly, you know, we will disarm, we will surrender, and we wish to negotiate from that point forward, I don't think Prime Minister Abiy would reject that. I think he would be very eager to take them up on that offer. But so far, the TPLF is refusing to negotiate, except, you know, at the point of a gun. And that leaves Prime Minister Abiy in a very difficult position of basically granting them impunity if he doesn't pursue these military tactics. And as you say, I don't think, you know, again, I'm not Ethiopian, and I don't have access to the kind of public opinion polling that would allow you to confidently make this statement. But it appears from dialogue that's gone on in the parliament and from the strong apparent public reaction in Ethiopia in support of what Abiy is describing as a rule of law operation, that he is not in a position to pull back. As you say, I think that the consequences for him politically would be very severe. So he has fewer choices than he's given credit for in the Western press.
Yeah, absolutely. So what are the long-term and short-term implications of this war for East Africa's peace and stability in the broader implication? Because I think for Ethiopia, maybe we don't have enough information to speculate. Of course, it's not a good thing. Of course, we're probably going to continue to pay for this for the next few years. But how does it look like in Eastern African politics when we look at it in a broader sense?
I mean, I think that there are reasons to be very hopeful, and I think that there are reasons to be very worried. You know, I would say in a very best case scenario, what you could be looking at, you know, if indeed the TPLF has lost touch with the Tigrayan people, and there is, you know, a sense of openness to a new dispensation in Tigray. Mm-hmm. And if because of the removal of the old TPLF guard, there's able to be progress on the peace agreement with Eritrea. And if that peace agreement with Eritrea leads to access to the sea and a free trade zone and all of the economic benefits that would flow from that, I mean, that could potentially create a renaissance in Tigray. You know, where the territory of Tigray would suddenly take on a much greater economic importance than it had previously, and a centrality that it didn't have previously. And I think that could be a wonderful thing. But it depends very heavily on the conduct of this war. If Prime Minister Abiy and his his Ethiopian defense forces are regarded as having committed atrocities or having produced an unacceptable number of civilian casualties, it's going to be very hard for the Tigrayan people to move forward with the rest of Ethiopia. And so in his statements, I've seen Prime Minister Abiy emphasizing how hard he's trying to avoid civilian casualties. I hope that is the case, because I think Ethiopia's future is really dependent, because of Tigray's position and the importance of that access to the sea. Like, all of Ethiopia has a stake in making sure that the people of Tigray are brought along and aren't unnecessarily brutalized by this war. So hopefully, if he can do that, then I have a real sense of optimism about what this could mean for the Horn of Africa, like a real sense of optimism. And I do think that the Ethiopian government could be doing a better job of communicating that. Though I recognize the sensitivities of talking about what may happen with that border, given the TPLF's antipathy towards Eritrea currently. Yeah, I am also worried about the Ethiopian pullout from Somalia. Though, to be fair, I'm much less worried about that withdrawal than I am about the U.S. withdrawal, which has been announced at the same time. Between the two of those things, that a period of great instability is coming to Somalia, and that will have consequences for the rest of the region as well. So it's a period of great unrest, I think, which could end well, or it could end really badly, sort of depending, again, on how this war is prosecuted.
It's true. I think just looking at the greater sense of East Africa, right, that some of the political turmoil in Sudan as well as, like you said, pulling out the Somalian forces to the same degree, though I think the Ethiopian government was criticized for going into war in Somalia to begin with. Mm-hmm. It might be maybe not interesting is not a good word for it. It might be a hard few years for people that live there if this war doesn't turn out in a way that the prime minister is hoping it to be executed. So we'll have to wait and see again, like many things. But we'll come back after a quick break. Thank you everyone for joining us in this conversation. Please go ahead and share and like this conversation for us, and we'll be back. Welcome back, everyone. We're just watching a video of prayer that is happening in Aksum. Definitely not people that are eager for war, as we could see, but that was something that was shared with us. To pick up this conversation, let's go over a little bit about like the media coverage of this conflict or war. I don't even know what to call it. What's a correct word for this that makes it seem that really describes what happens, right? But you can answer that question for me if possible. I think for me, calling it a war seems yes, it does have the product of war. We're going to see that. But at the same time, it feels like it's bigger than what it is. So I'm having a hard time even describing it as war. What do you think of that? Or am I just playing the semantics?
No, I don't think it's semantics at all. I think these things matter tremendously. And one of the things that I found very worrying is the constant description in the press of this as a civil war. When really this is a very small percentage of the population that is involved in the area of fighting. I think the media has shifted a little bit and is starting to say that it's at risk of becoming a civil war, which is better. But even then, I think that it overlooks the fact that what we are witnessing is actually more like an insurgency, and a fairly narrow insurgency at that when you're talking about the population. The TPLF's constituency, assuming 100% of Tigrayans support it, which I think is probably not true, we would be talking about 5% of Ethiopia's population. So this is a very narrow insurgency, but it's being described as a war because of perceptions that the TPLF's army and military capacity is roughly equal to that of the Ethiopian government. Again, that we don't know whether that's true or not. And I would say that the Ethiopian Defense Forces appear to be making progress more quickly than they were expected to. But still, I mean, the description of the war basically implies that there are two nation states going at each other, and that's not particularly helpful.
Yeah. So how do we move away from that narrative as Ethiopians as well as in the Western media? Because I would love to say this is just a Western media issue, but I've seen my own friends say, the Ethiopian government has waged war against its own people, or against the Tigrayan people, or this is a genocide of Tigrayan people as well. How do we move away and really see? I know it's hard to do so when emotions are involved, and especially if your family is living in those areas. But how do we move away from that narrative in a way that's productive to be able to understand what's going on and maybe lend a hand if possible?
I think it's hard to do that now, in particular, and I think that frankly, the government's decision to stop the communications to and from Tigray makes it harder for Ethiopians to do that, because there is no way to counter the narrative of genocide if people can't see what's going on. And so my view would be the best way to help people to really have a realistic understanding of the conflict would be to let people see what's happening. And in the absence of that, I think it's very natural for people to be afraid and to fear that a genocide is taking place. I mean, I cannot imagine what families who can't reach their relatives are feeling. Yeah. This is not something that can produce feelings of confidence, frankly. And so the first thing in my view that has to go on is that the government has to let journalists into Tigray. And it has to make it possible for people to contact their relatives so they can be told whether or not a genocide is going on. Without that, I think it's very difficult to make progress on the narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's also history. I think we mentioned it earlier as well, that sense of, whenever there's an instability or when the government fears of such, there's a shutdown of communication, water, electricity. I remember this during the Ethio-Eritrean War. Even I remember neighbors were being kicked out of the country because all of a sudden they were Eritreans, even though for the regular, for the day-to-day people, that didn't really matter. It was just their neighbors were being kicked out of the country, right? And I think right now, to the same degree, people are losing their jobs in Addis Ababa and all over the world. And the government is saying that it's because they're part of, the regime and they're helping the TPLF, and I can't allow that. Whereas people are just seeing it as, these are Tigrayan people that are being kicked out. This is, another form of oppression. And this is a way for the government to take power away from people, and how would they feed themselves, right? That day-to-day question of it. So how do you think we can move away from this narrative of repeating history of who's right and who's not, and just keeping the war where it is and leaving everything else out of the equation so that we can heal better later on?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, again, a really challenging situation for the government.
Yeah.
I don't think that in many cases the government has been terribly transparent with the evidence that it has, for accusing the TPLF of instigating various acts of violence, or for the reasoning behind arresting or detaining certain individuals or removing them from their jobs. And without that transparency, it's hard for average people to get a sense of whether it's justified. No, that's a problem that happens. National security actions are not transparent sometimes by their nature. But in particular, the government's actions now are coming, as we said earlier, in the wake of decisions to arrest large numbers of political opponents, not only members of the TPLF, but of the OLF and other political groups, and shutoffs of the internet and other actions that have made people question the commitment to democratic principles. And so this is a really tough thing. And I think it's going to require changes in the way the government is doing business, frankly, and probably an end of the conflict too. But I think it's really hard, on the one hand, to talk about wanting to restore, national security and law and order. That's a great and very reasonable objective. But I think you have to be very careful about giving the impression that you're targeting an ethnic group, not only because it makes people in Ethiopia feel unsafe, as they should feel unsafe if that's taking place, but because it reduces the Ethiopian government's position in the international community. It reduces the amount of support that they can draw on from players like Washington. And so it's all about being judicious and just doing the right thing. And it's hard. It's really hard, I think, even for me, sitting in Washington with direct access to the Prime Minister's office and direct access to the African Union and everything else. I have a hard time understanding what's happening and how much of this is justified and how much of this is something you should really be upset and worried about. And so I don't think, average Ethiopians who are taking in this news at the end of a long workday, I get paid to do this 24 hours a day, and I can't, it's hard for me to work out. So I think it's really a challenge for the average Ethiopian citizen.
Yeah. And I think also that the idea of ethnic federalism came in with the TPLF, and we're seeing it work right now in many parts of Ethiopia. And as Ethiopians, we're having such a hard time separating the criminal from its, for the ethnic group, and not even fully understanding what's going on at the heart of it, right? I could talk about, the Oromo speaking people did this and that, or the Tigrayan speaking people did that, or the Amara speaking people did that. But by the end of the day, we all know that everybody lives in every part of the country, at least used to be, and I don't necessarily speak the language my parents do speak. So where do we really draw that line? And really seeing that, it's not just, this problem is not just about one ethnic group. It's about the problem of Ethiopia and the ethnic federalism that TPLF has enforced very, very well, in a way that maybe they really did intended it so that people could govern themselves. But I could also say they intended it so that they could divide and conquer and stay in power for a long time, right? And being able to see that now happening to their own, who they consider their own at least, it's almost like comical if people weren't losing their livelihood and their lives in this situation, to see, look at what you created and look at how it's hurting you now instead of helping you the way that you think is helping you. And I have a hard time moving away from that, look what you did mindset. And it takes me a minute to come out of it and say, the people didn't do this. And that's me, like you said, sitting so far away from the situation and only getting a small dose of it as I need it. And I can regulate how much news I can get, and I can remove myself from the situation, and I'm not directly being hurt by it. So to have that kind of mindset as where I am right now, and to really try and understand what Ethiopians might be feeling in Ethiopia, it's difficult to see where are we going, really, what is the end of this, in and understanding who we are and understanding who our government should be and understanding setting our own political agendas, not necessarily the TPLF's political agenda, not necessarily the OLF's political agenda, not even the Prime Minister's political agenda, right? Who are we as people and what do we want? I don't know how we could get to that conversation. And if you have, I mean, I know you have experience a lot in these kinds of governance issues. What do you think we could do as far as really trying to understand what we want as people and trying to ask that from our governments, as opposed to the government always setting that agenda for us and basically demanding submission?
Yeah, I mean, this is. I wish that I had the kind of knowledge and wisdom, that would be helpful in a situation like this. I mean, even in Washington D.C., where we, we're not, our family members are not subject to warfare, to the fighting that's going on in the north. That this conflict has brought tension so high. Yeah. And pitted, people against each other, even here. And I think it's very difficult, as essential as it is, it's very difficult to step back from this conflict. And, I do believe that the role of people like you and me, Hewitt, is really just to say that, the average Tigrayan has had no role in this. They've had no power in this. They had no say in it. They didn't benefit from it. And that, as difficult as it is, the best thing that we can do is recognize that there is a small group of people at the top of the TPLF who have crossed a red line, and everybody agrees that they've crossed a red line, and that they will be subject to proceedings, lawful proceedings, to ensure that they don't hurt other people. But then after that, everybody has got to find a way of ensuring that those average Tigrayans are brought into this national dialogue that you're talking about, because they can't be penalized by the actions of a few old men that they can't control. And so, as difficult as that is, I mean, Ethiopia's success in the future is going to depend wholly on the ability to heal and forgive. And I'm not an expert in how those processes work. I wish I were, but that national reconciliation is actually, I think, something that might even need to take place before a national dialogue can happen. I have to say that I've spent a lot of years working in Somalia, for example. Yeah. And one of the things that's been a problem in Somalia is the fact that the country kept trying to move forward without actually taking an accounting of what had been done in the past. Yeah. And sort of, going through the process of reckoning and apologizing and forgiveness and peace building. And then it's really hard to move forward without that taking place. And so I have to say my very sheltered sort of external view is that calls for national dialogue have to be preceded by some kind of a not necessarily a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, but some kind of internal process, a national healing process, before dialogue can really start to be constructive. And I hope that there's really an effort to think about that, because I haven't heard many calls for it so far. But I think that personally, that is the first step. And that what we can do as journalists and commentators is really just to remind people about what's at stake. The grudges from the past are threatening Ethiopia's future.
I think one of our activists, Ethiopian Obang, I don't know if you know him, there was something, yes, yeah. There was something that he said that I really loved, and that was, as much as we're willing to accept the goodness of Ethiopians, we should also be able to accept the awful parts of who we are and the things that we've done to each other. Until we accept the good and the bad, because it is part of our history, we'll never be able to move forward in a peaceful and prosperous way that we really want to. And I think there's a lot of power in that. Like you said, without a national reconciliation, really holding election just ridiculous for me. And I think that's what makes it really hard for Prime Minister Abiy as well. As much as, there are people that love him, there are people that hate him or criticize him and think he's doing a horrible job. But whatever our view of the Prime Minister is, sometimes looking at things from his view, where he had a hard time with the military not being really for him and for his agenda, and a lot of the issues that he's been faced in Oromia region with the church burnings, and the prosecution of people for who they believe in and the language they speak, and not being able to gain control of even the military leaving right before a massacre happens, right? Yes, we could say Prime Minister Abiy did that because the militia or the military should answer to him as the prime minister. But in some cases, he had no control of it. And people hate that he doesn't have as much power as he should as the governor of Ethiopia. But to the same degree, they really question the fact that, is this really what he wants to do, right? Is he really there to protect people the way a government should? Because he hasn't been able to protect his own people. Now we could talk about, he needed to go to the north and, do this fight that was picked for him, but he hasn't done a very good job as far as having the rule of law rule the land in southern Ethiopia and Oromia. And it's really difficult for me to even see what he could possibly do. And we might need to give him some time to really understand what the goal is for that. But we can't move forward until we really figure out who we are and how we could accept the good and the bad of the land and who we are. I guess I keep on saying who we are, but that's really at the heart of understanding for me, right? And if I grew up in Addis. And growing up in Addis, you grow up around a lot of languages, a lot of cultures and traditions, and your neighbors have a certain way of doing things, and the other neighbor has a different way of doing things. And that's okay because that's normal. But looking at throughout the Ethiopia and not knowing some cultures that I have no clue about, some lands that I have never even heard of, how do we move forward, right? How do we call those people Ethiopians, just like we are Ethiopians, if we don't have that understanding of who everyone that lives in Ethiopia is? But I think that's all I have for you today, but I'd like for you to close if you have any last thoughts that you want to share with us.
Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Hewitt. I learned a lot from you, and I really, I really appreciate you inviting me, and it's a great honor to be here. And the only thing that I would say in closing is that I really hope that that at the end of this conflict, things will improve. Yeah. And one of the things that I will be looking very closely at is whether Prime Minister Abiy is able to start doing fewer of the things that the TPLF itself was doing while it was in power. In particular, freedom of the press, the ability to communicate on the internet whenever you want to, and especially the release of political prisoners. There are some truly magnificent people who have been arrested recently, whose voices are essential, in my view, in any national dialogue moving forward. And as long as they're in prison, I don't see how a national dialogue or national reconciliation can take place. So I really hope that we can move past this stage where people with divergent political views wind up in jail. And to me, that's the most important thing. And if Prime Minister Abiy is able to end this conflict and release the people who have been arrested over the last several months and can oversee the kind of reconciliation process that we're talking about, then I think Ethiopia's future is just amazingly bright. It's a true challenge, and it's very hard to see how you get there from here. But there are so many economic benefits that could come in the near future between the GERD and the potential of access to the sea. And when the pie gets bigger, it just becomes easier to make compromises. And I really hope that will be the case. And I really hope that Abiy turns out to be the right person to lead that process. But if not, then that's what elections are for.
Yeah, and hopefully we'll have a clean election as we've been promised. And thank you so much for being here. But before we close, I'd like to say some things to my friends and to Ethiopians, especially that live abroad. And I've been listening like a lot about what BBC thinks, what Al Jazeera thinks, and all the people that show up to these shows, Ethiopians that show up to these shows and say, whatever they feel like, which is, more power to them and more power to us for being able to speak our own truth. But I want to ask, as those of us that may not have the tool or the exposure of BBC or Al Jazeera, and we watch this, and to really be careful about the information that is being shared with us and the information that is spread by activists, because these same activists, right, the learned men and women of Ethiopia that live abroad, we've seen them on BBC and Al Jazeera, and 3, 4, 5 years ago, they were telling us how we should be enraged by the crime that TPLF has committed on Ethiopia and on its people, and we should be enraged that people don't have the right to self-govern, and how the political system has been dominated by TPLF, and being really angry about the things that are going on, and feeling that the youth that were doing this activism on land in Ethiopia, that they had their just cause, and they should pay the price for the freedom, right? We said that, we continue to say that for 4 or 5 years until the end of the TPLF regime. And then now we're seeing these same people going on BBC and Al Jazeera and saying, TPLF is a defender of self-determination. And for us, really, we need to stop and think for ourselves. I think we know what's right and we know what's wrong, and we don't need an activist to tell us that. We don't need someone with a degree to tell us that. I think we could figure that out on our own, because God has given us our own conscience to be able to think through what is right and what is wrong. And we should do that on our own, as opposed to trying to listen to everybody around us and trying to pick a slogan from one guy and transfer it to another and do our, armchair activism here, when we know that the people that are actually being affected are the farmers, right? Not TPLF, not Prime Minister Abiy, but the poor farmers that don't have shoes, the poor farmers that only eat once a day, the poor farmers that lost his wife for childbearing because there isn't any hospitals nearby. These are the people that are losing their lives. These are the people that are losing their day-to-day way of existing. And it doesn't matter what language they speak. It doesn't matter who they worship. Those are the people that we should care about. It's not some guy sitting somewhere in Washington or in Seattle or in Germany saying whatever they want to say, because we really don't have as much things that we lose, because like we all know, right? We have clothes full of closets. We have food everywhere that we go to. We have a comfortable couch we sit in, and we continue to perpetuate the same ignorant tweets and the same ignorant Facebooks and the same ignorant slogans on our Instagrams. But I really want to ask all of us to really sit and think for ourselves, read for ourselves, and read what everybody's saying, not just the people that you agree with are saying, but the people, especially the people you don't agree, are saying, to come to this dialogue that we need to. I know we all continue to say we need to have a dialogue, but that dialogue is only happening with the people we agree with, and that's not going to get us anywhere. So at least for once, there was this thing that I read on by November 4th, there were 900,000 tweets sent out about this war by Ethiopians, right? How about we send those tweets about the poor people that are living in Ethiopia without food? How about we send those tweets about the people that don't have education, about the schools that we're going to build in, because that's what we need? How about we set our own agenda for the government, as opposed to waiting for TPLF to tell us something, or LF to tell us something, or the prime minister to come out and tell us? How about we take that responsibility on our own, as opposed to waiting for the government to do anything? Because we've seen time and time again. I was born during the TPLF regime, so I don't know much about Dirk, but I've heard about it, I've read about it. And the government is not going to give us anything that we want until we know exactly what we want. What do we want? I think we need to answer that first and foremost. Do we want food? Do we want education? Do we want hospitals? Then that's fine. If that's what we want, it doesn't matter who speaks what language. It doesn't matter who worships where. It doesn't matter where we live, as long as we provide that to our people. So let's be clear about the things that we want. If it's ethnicity and federalism and all those things that we want, we're getting that right now, and we're not surviving it. Ethiopia is not going to survive this the way we're going. So if we send one tweet about a horrible thing that is happening in Ethiopia, let's send another one with a solution that we've read about, because Ethiopia's situation is not unique. There are other countries that went through it. There are solutions out there. So let's do our homework and tweet that out as well. Because just tweeting about the horrible things that are happening is not activism. Nobody cares about your hashtag. I personally don't care about your hashtag. I don't care about Abiy should leave or TPLF should leave and all those things that we're saying. It looks nice. It looks pretty. You get your own little community on Twitter, but it doesn't do anything for the poor people in Ethiopia. I don't know how many times we need to say that. I don't know how many times we need to continue to say this. But for me, I will personally continue to say that. If you post something on Twitter about something that happened in northern part of Ethiopia, and if you don't post anything about what's been happening in Oromia, if you don't post anything about what's been happening in the southern Ethiopia, you're not for human rights. You're for your own ethnic group, and you are part of the problem. So I'm going to continue to call that you are part of the problem, not the solution. If there's a problem in Ethiopia, you should care about all the problems that are happening in Ethiopia, not just when your ethnic group is touched, not just when your church is touched, not just your mosque when your mosque is burned. So if we care about human rights, we should care about every human being that lives in Ethiopia, at the minimum, to be able to live where they want and live out of poverty. That's not the conversation we're having. We're having a conversation of ethnic group and religion and who is in power and who's not in power, who's criminal and who's not criminal. Let's stop caring about that, and let's set our own agenda in a way that is empowering the poor people that are in Ethiopia right now. And let's put our Twitters where we think it should go, and let's put our money where it thinks we should go, and let's study and read everything that we have, not just the things that we agree with. And I think I've said more than enough of what I wanted to say today. I'm going to close it if that's unless you have something you want to add to this, Bronan.
No, that was amazing advice. I appreciate it. And I think you're 100% right.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining in this conversation. I really appreciate you for being here, Brown, and taking a day out of your Sunday and participating in this conversation and sharing in your expertise of governors really in Africa. And I really appreciate the work that you do. And thank you again for being here. And everyone, if you have been here with us for as long as we have, thank you again. And go ahead and share and like this conversation, and let's keep this dialogue going. Let's be open-minded about it, and let's find ideas that we don't agree with and read about those instead of the ideas that we agree with. And thank you for joining us. Until next week, have a wonderful week.
አደባባይ ሚዲያ ለወገንተኝነት ጀርባውን የሰጠ ጊዜያዊ ጥቅምን አምብኝ ብሎ የዘመመን ሊያቀና እውነትና እውቀትን አስከትሎ ኢኮኖሚያዊና መንፈሳዊ መረጃዎችን እንካችሁ ይላል። ትኩስ ዜናዎች፣ ዘጋቢ ፊልሞች፣ ጥልቅ ትንታኔዎች በአደባባይ ሚዲያ ይቀርባሉ። ራእያችን ጊዜውን ያማከለና ዘመኑን የዋጀ በእውነት የነጠሩ መረጃዎችን በእውቀት ደግፎ ለሀገራችን ብሎም ለዓለም ሕዝብ ማዳረስ ነው። አድሬሳችን adebabayinfomedia@gmail.com፣ ዌብሳይታችን www.adebabai.com። ያግኙን፣ ይርዱን። የሁላችንም ስለሆነች ኢትዮጵያ በአደባባይ እንዘግባለን። አደባባይ ሚዲያ